Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University. Before we begin, I have a couple of announcements. This event is being recorded and will be available for free on YouTube and iTunes. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we will post this forum in a couple weeks. If you are sharing a comment or question, please speak directly into the microphone, and so that both the audience and the video camera will pick it up. Please understand that by speaking, you are giving the Ford Hall Forum permission to record you. And now, please turn off your cell phones. The Ford Hall Forum would like to thank our generous sponsors, including, among others, the Lowell Institute, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, the Barr Foundation, the Nellie May Education Foundation, and our partners at Suffolk University, which serves as the forum's home base. The forum also thanks our members whose generosity makes our free public events possible. If you're not a member yet, please become one today by visiting the information table before you leave. Tonight's forum is being held in honor of Frederick G. Corneal, who was my father, number one, and also a longtime member of the Ford Hall Forum Board. And he was a great supporter of the forum and the ideas that it represents in terms of encouraging free speech. And I know he'd be very interested in what you all have to talk about this evening. And I would just say that I'm sure he would be advocating for a peaceful solution to our problems. Our moderator this evening is Robert Laffey. Robert is an assistant professor in the government department at Suffolk University. His fields of interest include international relations, Middle Eastern politics, and U.S. foreign policy. And his research interests are U.S. and Middle East relations and the U.S. and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Laffey's presentations include Christian Communities in the Middle East at the Paulus Center in 2003 and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in historical perspective at Providence College in 2002. He is currently working on a paper entitled The U.S. Senate and Its Support for Israel. Please join me in welcoming Robert Laffey and our distinguished guests this evening. We're looking forward to the program very much.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to introduce, first of all, Elizabeth Thompson. And Elizabeth is the author of the book that has brought us together here. Elizabeth is an associate professor in the Corcoran Department of History at the University of Virginia. She specializes in 20th century Middle Eastern history, including social movements and the public sphere. She graduated from Harvard in 1981, completed her MIA and PhD at Columbia. She is the author of Justice Interrupted, The Struggle for Constitutional Government in the Middle East, and also Colonial Citizens, Republican Rights, Paternal Privilege, and Gender in French, Syria, and Lebanon. Elizabeth has received awards from such sources as the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the United States Institute of Peace, and the Carnegie Corporation of New York. She's currently involved in several projects that approach issues of citizenship, state formation, and foreign intervention in the 20th century Middle East. And our second...
thank you. Thank you.
Our second guest is Leila Farsakh, who is an associate professor in political science at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She is the author of Palestinian Labor Migration to Israel, Labor, Land, and Occupation, and editor of Commemorating the Nakba, Evoking the Nakba in the Electronic Journal of Middle Eastern Studies. She has also published on questions related to Palestinian labor flows, the Oslo process, and international migration in a wide range of journals. In 2001, Leila won the Peace and Justice Award from the Cambridge Peace Commission in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Leila holds a PhD from the University of London, Master's in Philosophy from the University of Cambridge, and a BA from the University of Exeter. She undertook a postdoctoral research fellowship at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University and is now a senior research fellow at the Center for Development Studies at Birzeit University in the West Bank. I think we'll begin this evening and move right into some contemporary issues and ask Elizabeth to start us off. Elizabeth, what would you argue are some of the roots of the Arab Spring, which occurred in 2 years ago, in February, beginning, well, actually, at the end of 2010, December,
That's right.
and then moving into 2011. And is it still alive? And where is it going? And we want to try to delve into some of these questions.
Oh, good. Well, start small. It's a big question. I imagine all of you have followed to some degree or another the events of the last couple of years, 2.5 years really, across the Middle East, and beginning in Tunisia with the protest of a fruit vendor that turned into, and his death by self-immolation, which was then turned extraordinarily into a nationwide movement, fed partly at first by friends and family in his small town, but then picked up by labor unions, which had been politically dormant, really, under a dictatorship in that country. Finally reaching the capital, reaching international media, and toppling by mid-January, right, of 2011, Ben Ali, the dictator of more than a dozen years, right? It was the demonstration effect of that success that fed a movement that had already begun in Egypt and would soon, a month later, see the overthrow, very reluctantly, of the president of Egypt, Hosni Mubarak. Movements in the Gulf, in Yemen, in Bahrain, and then, as we know, in Syria. Outcomes very different, also Libya, right? Difficult to say, is it still an Arab Spring if the movement met resistance and turned into a war? We can discuss that later, right? But maybe just to start a conversation, we should think about where did those dictators come from? B, a question, you mentioned I had an award from the U.S. Institute of Peace. I'll give you an anecdote. This is, oh boy, I hate to say it, 6 years ago when I first seriously started writing the book. And a board member, a very prominent person in Washington, leaned over during the interview to me and said, "Are you telling me there are Democrats in the Middle East that we can work with?" And I said, yes, and there have long been Democrats in the Middle East that we can work with. And I think the anecdote opens up for us a couple of things to talk about. One, are people discovering democracy in the Middle East in the Arab Spring, or are they reviving something from the past? As a historian, I have a tendency to look to the past and see patterns. Number two, though, also is a question of, why are we asking, are there Democrats we can work with? Precisely, that politics in the Middle East very much involves politics not just as a sort of discrete unit within a country, but the outcomes and the inspiration for many of the movements of the Arab Spring came from not only neighboring countries in the region, but also from well beyond the region, from global trends. And it is those international influences that will also shape the outcomes of the Arab Spring. Now, the outcomes are already very different. I'm going to give you a long history lecture, right? We notice, most recently, I read an article about Tunisia, which had a very rough set of elections. An Islamist movement gained power. They're still debating over their constitution, but recent polls actually show the enduring economic problems that had actually fed, remember the fruit vendor in Tunisia, and sparked the movement in the first place, are now bringing much discontent with that Islamic government and unity amongst its opposition. This is what we like to see, right? Yeah. I'd say things are very much alive in Tunisia, and I hope we'll discuss that a little bit more, Leila. Egypt, well, a rougher road, but an interesting and very lively one, right? The army has stepped aside. Again, an Islamically oriented party gained power in elections. Much discontent over the way a constitution was adopted, but one was last fall. Much discontent over a sour economy, but polls show more enduring support, particularly outside of cities, for the government of Mohamed Morsi, the president, right? Yeah. I don't know whether today you want to, maybe I'll turn things over to you a little bit, just to sort of set out where we are before we talk about what, how to analyze it, but the Gulf and Syria, Libya are very different cases.
Yes, I do think, though, when we're talking about the Arab Spring, many people right now feel completely perplexed and think, has it gone bust, or are we now at point zero again? I like what you said, are there Democrats in the Middle East? And I think if there's something we've learned with the Arab Spring is how there are lots of Democrats, and these Democrats are not just a bunch of intellectuals or academics or elite, but actually the average person. The average person, be it from Yemen, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, to Tunisia, which is among the most prosperous countries in the Middle East. In both these very different places, economically and politically, you have had massive demonstration, protest, largely peaceful. One should not forget that, in demand of democracy, in demand of accountable government, in demand of constitutions. So I think this has been a very important moment, and I don't think it's a lost moment. The fact that we're seeing now so many difficulties is just an indication of how difficult it is to create a democratic, accountable government. But the perseverance of the uprising and the instability in it also reflects how much people are very eager not to give up the struggle, and how much they are emphasizing something very important, which often gets overlooked in the Middle East, because as US foreign policy, we're very much concerned with stability, with oil, fear of the Islamists. What we see in these demonstrations and these uprisings is really a reclaiming by the citizens of their rights. People are talking about rights. They're not talking about revolution. They're not talking about Islam or sectarianism, which is very popular in the media here. They're really talking about they want basic rights. And basic rights are rights to a job, right to freedom, right to security, right to accountable government, right to live a decent life rather than live under an oppressive, corrupt government. Now, I think this we can see all across the spectrum. This happened in Yemen, as I said. I mean, I found Yemen one of the most fascinating countries because it's one of the poorest countries in the Middle East, one in which every man carries a dagger, and yet it's a place where we had relatively peaceful demonstration for over 6 to 9 months, and it got settled because of regional intervention, basically Saudi Arabia. In terms of what determined the success and failure in various places, and what do we mean by success and failure? I suppose the success of the uprising is how far have people been able to come up with a new constitution. And so far, the only country that succeeded to create a new constitutional assembly and is trying to formulate a new constitution has been Tunisia. It still has not been submitted for a referendum. We're still waiting for that. Egypt has also tried that, but Egypt has had a much bumpy road because, as you rightly said, the role of the military. But there also, I think, Egypt, when people despair at Egypt and say, well, why are they fighting again? Can we trust the Islamists? The Islamists are in power. I think it's very important, again, to remember that the Islamists are people like us. They are maybe more on the conservative side, but they're not people who want revolution. They're businessmen. They're people who might be conservative culturally, socially, but in the end, they're not people for revolution. They're not people against the US. They're people who just feel that their moment to get to power has come, and they've proved to have worked for the past 40 years in very effective grassroots way and have so far, I would say, even Morsi, shown that he is capable to accept the democratic game. The problem is that there is a lack of trust because people lack experience, I think, in how to play a democratic game. But I think everybody wants to play a democratic game. I think the military doesn't want to play the democratic game, but they're trying hard. I think the big puzzle for many people would be Libya and Syria. Libya, really, the challenge in Libya is that Libya was really lacked institutions that Egypt and Tunisia have. Egypt has strong institutions, be it the courts, be it political parties, be it trade unions, be it the military. The military in Egypt is professional to a large extent, the same thing in Tunisia. In Libya, unfortunately, we had a Gaddafi family ruling a country and stealing really the resources of the country. That once he did not seek Gaddafi to create institutions of the state, in other words, a real Ministry of Defense, a real military, a real Ministry of Finance. The only thing that was intact is oil, and what saved oil really is our foreign intervention. This is why the international community went there. Libya today faces big challenge, two major challenges, I would say. One, how to create a new state. Okay, what is saving it is that oil is being pumped out, and there is a flow of money coming into the country. But there is big problem of trust between the various parties. There's a big problem of how do you reconcile after years of doing a split between the eastern region and the western region, which Gaddafi perpetuated. Lack of trust between the tribes, lack of trust between those who fought for the revolution in the deserts and those who reaped the benefit, who are living in the cities. So the question, how are we going to balance that? How are we going to sort it out? And I would think it's normal in any revolution, especially that lacked institution like the judiciary, for example, that can act as a body that can account for grievances, hear different grievances, and come to a resolution. Libya does not have that. Bahrain is also a very fascinating story, a very important story. It doesn't get told a lot because it's a very little island with less than 1 million people living in it, but in which had, as you know, the historian, for the past 30 years have had always a very important community which have been asking for constitutional monarchy. They've had two important political parties. In the media, often we portray them, they are the majority Shiite who are against really the Sunni leaders. But the problem is not really sectarian, and I've never phrased it in a sectarian way. The government has often labeled them in a sectarian way, have often said Iran is behind them, but they've very much emphasized a nationalist democratic agenda. We want a constitutional monarchy, we respect this monarchy, but we want basic rights. Again, freedom to hold our government accountable, freedom to have jobs, freedom of the press. But that was very alarming for countries like Saudi Arabia, that it got crushed. Now, of course, the big story is Syria. Syria is actually a very tragic situation. Everybody asks, how could a peaceful demonstration that started 2 years ago turn into a horrendous civil war, which cost the life now, we estimate, around 60,000 Syrian, and we're talking about 3 million refugees, which is quite alarming. We cannot put all the blame on the government. The Assad regime is definitely repressive and doesn't want to give up power, but the fact that also the opposition has been militarized and opted for such aggressive war reveals to us that any resolution and any outcome for any Middle East uprising cannot be resolved without taking also the regional configuration into the story. So just as the institutions of the state, the role of political parties, the role of political Islam in each country is very important, I think the example of Syria demonstrates to us how important is the regional powers and the calculations of regional powers in determining if a revolution can succeed or not. One of the reasons we often say why Tunisia succeeded is because it was the backdrop of the Middle East and nobody paid so much attention. One of the reasons why the revolution succeeded in Egypt was in the end that the Obama administration decided to uphold and support the Egyptian going out in the street and demanding accountable government, to the big dismay of Saudi Arabia. And one of the reasons why the Bahraini revolution or uprising failed is because Saudi Arabia said, we will not have this in our backyard. And now one of the reasons why it succeeded in Libya is because of foreign intervention that was coordinated with regional support. The role of Qatar and Saudi Arabia was central to the success of the toppling of the Gaddafi regime. And now in Syria, what's happening is really a new Middle East Cold War, a new regional recalculation of who is going to be now the regional leaders fighting their war in Syria. This is how I would summarize it, but maybe we can talk more about where do we go from here, or...
I'd like to mention, before we continue with that, I was very happy to see you publish your book because in the classroom and in some of our readings, we have to deal with the question, is the relative lack of democracy in the Middle East. And many people jump to the conclusion, this is the way it's always been. And so I have to inform my students that that's not the case, and name some of the instances in which that was not the case. And so Elizabeth has done very good research in providing us through the eyes of the activists, a number of activists in different countries. I forgot how many case studies you had, but it was well worth the read. Going back to the 19th century, in the Ottoman Empire with the Tanzimat, and then looking at Iran in the early 20th century, Egypt, even before that, then Iran. And all these places did write constitutions. And there was constitutional government for a while in places like Syria and so forth. So it tells the story very well and gives us a sense of how we got where we are now and how things, what forces came into play that would destabilize a situation that was, there was an attempt to solidify a constitutionalism in a number of these countries at that time. So we have to look at the internal issues, as you did, and the external issues. So it's a good read, and I would recommend the book to the rest of the audience, so you get a sense of what was happening there. And I just want to mention about Syria, too. I don't know him, but there's a scholar, he teaches here in Mass, he's a Syrian fellow, Omar Dahi. Yeah. And he just was talking recently about the fact that in Syria, many people are concerned that the outside powers, and that would be the U.S. and its allies in the region, including Saudi, including the Qataris, including Israel and so forth, would like to divide Syria up again. And I say again because that's already happened couple of times in the 20th century. First, actually by the French a couple of times back at that time. We don't know if that will happen. I don't think the Syrian people want it to happen. And where are we going? International diplomacy. Is it possible that the United States and Russia can actually intervene and do something in a more positive way? To get both sides, because both sides don't want to sit down and talk to each other. The opposition, and I can understand where they're coming from, because the Assad regime is a dictatorship, and the opposition doesn't want to sit and talk with him. One of their first demands was, and the United States applauded this, because the United States has been opposed to the Syrian regime for a long time now, has enacted sanctions against the Syrian regime because Syria and Iran were, for the longest time, the only two countries that didn't come aboard the United States plan for the region. So the U.S. has a plan for the region. The U.S. has its client states. The U.S. knows what it would like to see as regional powers, and Syria certainly wasn't one of them. So will the U.S. and Russia do something that'll damp down the number of deaths in a country? Did you say 60,000? 60, we're not sure really. There's just so many, thousands of people. And it's a humanitarian issue. And I'm very suspicious of the whole notion of humanitarian interventionism. Not just suspicious, cynical. Because many countries say they're doing this for humanitarian reasons, and many times it's not really the case. As was well, I would say proven, as I would, from my reading and following, for example, what happened in the Balkans and Yugoslavia back in the 90s. I didn't see very much that was humanitarian, that in terms of the intervention.
But can I step in here? I think, you know, it would be very useful, for example, for us to try and understand. I mean, now with the civil war, it's very difficult to know what's going on in details, or what we hear is the horrors.
That's right.
But it would be very illuminating to know about what has been the history of Syria with constitutionalism and democracy. I mean, the fact that people decided after 30 years of Bashar al-Assad that it is better for them to just go and, you know, into the street than accept the security he provided, reveals to us that there is something happening in the Middle East which is irreversible. And what is, in my view, maybe irreversible is the fact that you don't have a new generation that is educated, that wants job, that is talking in a discourse of right. You know, we want rights, we want to protect. But it's also they're looking for their history to draw for them from it legitimacy, that this is not the first time that we're just waking up and want democracy. Exactly. So it would be very nice to know from you maybe what has been the trajectory of Syria road in constitutionalism, in demand for democracy, because it's been very alive and has been crushed over and over again.
Right. Yeah. The Syrians, the first time I went to Syria back in the early 90s, the first thing Syrians will tell you about their history is how their sovereignty was stolen after World War I. So pardon me while I give you a very mini history lesson here, right? But it demonstrates how long there have been Democrats in the region and the forces that have blocked, let's say, the growth of democratic government there. In World War I, most of what we call the Arab world was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, okay, seated in Istanbul, had been so for 400 years. In the last decades of the Ottoman Empire, there had been a constitutional revolution in 1908. And Syrians had participated in elections and elected people to a parliament in Istanbul. Then the Ottoman Empire was invaded. The Balkan Wars began. Italy invaded Libya, which was Ottoman territory. And I think those of you who have been sensitive to what has happened to our own domestic politics in this country since the attacks of 9/11, right, know that when countries are invaded, hawkish political interests gain ascendancy. And that is what happened in the Ottoman Empire. In 1913, a coup occurred after key cities beloved by the ruling elite were lost in the Balkans. The northern city of Thessaloniki in Greece was the hometown of many of the ruling elite in the Ottoman Empire, and they'd lost it. So a sort of military coup takes place right before the World War I breaks out. The parliament is not suspended at that point, but in practice, constitutional government was brought to a close in conditions of wartime. And that's not the first time. The 1908 constitutional revolution had actually been a restoration of the 1876 constitution, which was suspended in the event of a Russian invasion that threatened Istanbul in 1878. In my courses, one of the sources of the book and why I wrote the book I did was to see in my students' faces their eyes pop when I tell them, and I give them to read an article written by the virtual prime minister of the Ottoman Empire of the day and published in a British journal called The 19th Century in June 1878, pleading with Britain to support the restoration of constitutional government in the Ottoman Empire. Already in 1878, he has identified constitutional government as the only way in which the many different peoples of that empire could continue to coexist politically, and that the parliament itself would be an integrative institution. Number two, though, he has identified the fact that the fate of democracy in his country rests partly in the hands of foreigners whom he's never met, and particularly the British public, which had been fed by its own newspapers lurid stories of massacres of Christians in the Balkans, with very scant attention to any massacres of Muslims in the Balkans. And so the evil Turk, you know, was to receive no aid from Britain. Short story, the Constitution remained suspended for 30 years until the 1908 restoration. So you can see that the ruling elite in Syria during World War I has had experience with constitutionalism, but has seen it, that government taken from its hands by the event of war. We get to probably the high point. I'll defer to your expertise in American relations with the Middle East, but certainly a high point of Americans' relations with Middle Easterners, and that would be the year 1919. Right? Woodrow Wilson has proclaimed a war, that there is a point to the carnage of World War I, and the point is to make the world safe for democracy, right? Proposing a League of Nations that would adjudicate conflicts among nations rather than the resort to arms. You know the story, right? And a call for self-determination, sovereignty, even for the small nations around the globe. His speeches to Congress, with the 14 points and all, if you've read them, were translated immediately and published in Arabic newspapers, all right? People knew what Americans stood for. They did not know anything about what the Americans might be doing in Latin America at the moment, or in the Philippines, it's granted. But Americans were not greedy to control their territory. They knew that Europeans wanted to colonize the remaining territories of the now defunct and defeated Ottoman Empire. But they looked to the United States to guard their rights. And Wilson went to Paris with crowds in the streets, telegrams flooding in from Egypt, from Syria, from Indochina, from countries in Africa, all looking to see their day in the sun and to claim their rights. So the language of rights in the Middle East amongst mass political movements is very old. It's a century old at least, if not more. All right? So the Arab Spring is a revival of a politics and of a memory of a political era that seemed more open and hopeful than the period today. Now, Wilson did not live up to those ideals. He did not really have the leverage he needed to confront Britain and France, which wanted rewards, some kind of payoff for that terrible war. They went and France colonized in the name and with the permission of the League of Nations, Syria and Lebanon. Britain took Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine, and ruled them under the guise of mandates at that period, right? Despite polls that showed the people did not want them to come in, despite the evident support for Wilson's principles, all right? So that is the first moment that Syrians themselves organize to claim rights as a democracy, right? They had even, inspired by Wilson, convened a constitutional convention in 1920. And here's a point, and certainly another starting point for my book was this, to think about the role of Islam in this democratic history. Because so many of us in the United States see this dichotomy between Islamists and Democrats. And you know, if the Islamists win the elections, then the Arab Spring will end, right? And this is years before the Arab Spring, so I can't say, I can't claim to, you know, you can't accuse me, I guess, of loading the deck here, right? But what I found is that, to my surprise, at that constitutional convention in Syria in 1920, the president of that constitutional convention was a man named Sheikh Rashid Rida. He published the most well-known Islamic reform magazine in the Arab world. Very prominent personality, right? Wow. He presided over a constitution which was Islamic insofar as the king, King Faisal, had to be Muslim, and that laws should not explicitly violate Islamic law, nothing more. Right? He pronounced it an Islamic form of government in July 1920 with great satisfaction. Why? Because it was representative, right? The leader had to consult with the people over the laws, right? And that it promised equality to people, right? No problem. 8 years later, however, this was the sort of light bulb moment as I was writing the book, anyways. The French have come in. They come in with tanks. They literally, demolish that constitutional government. He flees to Egypt, continues to publish his magazine there, and 8 years later would inspire Hassan al-Banna to form the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the ruling party of Egypt today, right? The key difference was Rida, now very bitter, no longer believed that liberal principles were truly universal principles of justice. The Europeans had shown that there's one justice for Europe and another justice for peoples who are weak enough to be colonized. And so Banna took from the bitterness of Rida and his generation that had seen the demise of Ottoman constitutionalism and the rise of European colonialism, the message that justice lies elsewhere, not in Europe, not in universal principles, but in a separate realm of morality called Islam. That is the root of the growth of Islamic movements, in the disappointment and in the exclusion of the Arab world from full enjoyment of the rights that Woodrow Wilson had promised. And that was a great revelation to me. Down the way, through the chapters and through the stories I tell in the book, we come then to the Arab Spring. And I recognize that the Islamic movement is born out of the desire to have had and enjoyed and shared those same rights and having been excluded. It's a very complex heritage, and it does not come out of an antithetical political tradition to the democratic one, but rather one that is deeply intertwined with a long delayed and long deferred, or as I say in the title of the book, interrupted struggle for constitutional government. So I think Syrians and of all the peoples of the Middle East were very much alive to that historical moment lost in 1920. They are still taught it, or have been, in their textbooks, and rose up in 2011 in the spirit not of discovering something new from the West, but in the hope of retrieving something that they had felt was snatched by the West nearly a century before.
I agree.
And so it's a very different tenor. I write history because I think if we look at the complex strands and pull them apart, it gives us a new way of thinking about the future.
Yes.
Right? If you understand that this, in the minds of the people there, is restorative, right, and deeply felt, you have to regard the future in the Middle East through a different lens, right? That the problem is not teaching them to be democratic, right? The problem may be looking at what are the obstacles, what propped up the dictators that were toppled 2 years ago, right?
And what causes a revolutionary moment? Somebody gave me once a very beautiful metaphor. I met a woman from Egypt just 6 months ago, and she was in Tahrir Square when the revolution happened, and she said something very beautiful. She said, Leila, people think the revolution just happened one day. People got up in the street and liked being in Tahrir Square. But actually, we could feel it for the past 10 years. There was so much work being done everywhere. And then it was just the right moment, and everything came together. And I think this is something very important we need to bear in mind, that the revolution happened. You have the potential for a revolution when you have oppression. If when you don't have oppression, when we have accountability, when we have laws, when we have rights, you don't have revolution. You have revolution because you have repression, because you have oppression, because you have justice denied, as you rightly put it, and interrupted. So, but the core question is, when do people get fed up? Because people have been in the Middle East living under dictatorship for the past, that's our tragedy, for the past 45 years. They lived under dictatorship. What is it, at what point did they rebel or were able to rebel and succeed in the rebellion. Because in Egypt, in Tunisia, we've been having lots of demonstration and upheaval against economic injustice. We've had strikes in Egypt in 2008, in Tunisia in 2008. We had others in 2004. We had a big one in 2000. So there've been also strife for constitutional reforms with various parties like Kifaya in Egypt, like the trade unions in Tunisia. What is it that the moment that Ahmed Bouazizi burned himself, this fruit vendor, everything coalesced and came together. And I think there's always this, you need a context, and I think we cannot underestimate the importance of having had this heritage, this history, but also having had these grievances, and also bearing in mind the economic crisis. We've all had major uprising in the Middle East, when we had also an international crisis. And also in the US, we're having a crisis. We don't rebel because we have mechanism by which we can express our anger, we can express our worries, we can channel our debate, alternative way to deal with the unemployment we have, to deal with the injustice we have. In the Middle East, it was also an economic crisis. I mean, the reason why the revolution happened in 2011, among many other things, has been that we have a population in the Middle East, half of it is under 30 years of age. We have unemployment rates in Egypt which were of the range of 20%, and the youth unemployment particularly high, in the range of 25 to 30%. It means you are an educated, you went to university, you got a degree, and yet you cannot even find a job as a street vendor. That's the story of the guy in Tunisia. He was a graduate, a university graduate. So this unemployment, why did we have this unemployment? Because of major problem of government corruption, of the state stealing your money rather than the state giving you your money, giving you right. And above all, also problem of inequality. Again, it resonates with us. There has been growing inequality in the Middle East over the past, particularly over the past 15 years. And it's this inequality which has become unbearable. If you look at all the country where the revolution happened, or the uprising happened, it started from the rural areas. We often focus on Tahrir Square, or we focus on Tunis, but actually it happened first in rural areas. People started rebelling in Suez, in Alexandria, in various cities, in the Said, and then they converged into the city. So the capitals could not succeed if there wasn't already a base from the rural areas. And actually one of the reasons why the revolution in Syria, or the uprising in Syria, is turning the way it's turning is precisely because of the major inequality between people who live in rural areas versus those who live in urban areas. Again, without having institutional channels, legal channels, government willing to be accountable and forced to be accountable, the only mechanism by which people could say at one point enough is enough is through the uprisings. Now, and of course, this inequality has been aggravated with the international crisis we've had since 2008. I mean, this is a global crisis that has been touching the food. I mean, we call the uprising in Egypt. It's becoming now the bread revolution. People are scared that there will be another rebellion against Morsi, and they call it the rebellion of the hungry people, because prices have been going up. And why are prices going up? Because Egypt cannot produce its own wheat. And why it cannot produce its own wheat? Because of bad management. And why is wheat not available? Is because prices of wheat has went up because of the global crisis. So everything is interconnected. But the point is how much the economic crisis is at the heart, is a central component of the Arab uprising. But the language that people are using, it's very important to bear in mind, is the language that you nicely put it, is their own language, is their own history, is not something we're copying with the West. The Islamists are not these monsters. The Islamists are just people like you and me who are just proud of their culture but want accountable government and do not know how to manage the economy, given that they've never been put in a position to manage an economy. How are we going to manage all that? It's a process. I don't know of any revolution or any uprising that succeeded within a year or two. I mean, like, we can count on our own revolution in the United States. We can count on the French Revolution. You can look at any revolution you want. It has been a time of major upheaval. But there are promising signs when I look at how the parties in Egypt or the parties in Tunisia, if the Islamists themselves, they want to compromise, but I don't know how much to compromise. The opposition is not being scared or accept to subside in its opposition in holding the Islamists accountable. They're not succeeding yet to impose their agenda because the Islamists are much better organized, but they're able to assert their voice in a way they could not do before. And I think this is a great indication that it can succeed. We're having a certain balance of power, or we're not having the power anymore in one single institution. It's no longer just in the army. It's not just in the government. It's no longer just in the Islamists. There is various power centers. The problem, though, is how you're going to get these power centers to compromise. And that's a political game, okay? And here, foreign intervention can help or can aggravate the situation, which is the case in Syria, versus wanting to help the situation, as is the case in Libya or in Egypt. You know.
Ladies, I think we're going to open up the program now to questions from the audience. And just before we do it, because I wanted to mention something from the U.S. side before I forget. Maybe you're familiar with this. When the WikiLeaks occurred, and we looked at some of the documents, some of the documents showed that, I believe it was in 2009, I haven't looked at them for a while, regarding Egypt. The April 6th movement, of course, had already been created in Egypt, and a couple of the leaders of the younger leaders of the April 6th movement had been in Washington for a student conference. And they, attending this, of course, was the people from the State Department and U.S. intelligence, and they then also talked with the students. And interestingly, the students as reported by the U.S. intelligence and the State Department documents, had told the State Department that in 2 years, in January, and of course January 25 is important for a couple of reasons. I know you mentioned one in your book, but of course there's another one too. That was the time of the major uprising. You were talking about the strikes. There was the strikes at one of the major factories outside of Cairo, textile factory, where the workers were very dissatisfied. So they said, we'll begin our movement, and it'll be no, excuse me, I said January 2011. And the State Department response was, no, we don't agree with this. This isn't going to happen. Nobody can challenge Mubarak in the military. So I thought that was interesting, and I don't know if you ladies had a chance to see those documents.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So let's take some questions from the audience. This gentleman.
I'd like to hear some more specifics on what you recommend, what you think ought to happen in Syria. I didn't hear anything from you. Do you think that Assad has a future? Do you think he ought to stay on after what he's done? What do you think of the Russian involvement, their contributions to the situation, feeding Syria's weapons thirst? Is that a good thing? Do you think that they're providing something positive for that? And what do you think of Hezbollah's role in all of this? Is there anyone here who is a supporter of Hezbollah in their hatred of Israel, for example, and anyone who wants to resist them? And are you in favor of Israel's Iron Dome in keeping out missiles thrown their way by Hezbollah and other people who want to see Israel destroyed?
Hezbollah didn't send any missiles in. It was Hamas. You got it all mixed up.
Okay. Thank you for your question. And
shall we take a couple, maybe? Or how do you want to do it? Do you want to take a couple, or you want to address one by one? Do you want to take a couple of questions?
Oh, that's a good idea.
Or
okay. We'll take one more question from this side, and we'll go back and forth, alternate, and then we'll answer a couple at a time.
Well, Ho Chi Minh found out that Woodrow Wilson didn't mean what he said, too, so that's a long story. But ever since then, the United States has actually not lived up to its democratic credentials, and that's the story that Obama is continuing to repeat today. Obama was trying to prop up Mubarak right up until the very end, until he could no longer do so. His drone strikes, of course, are causing consternation in Yemen. He's waging war in Iran with sanctions and cyber attack. He's backing the blockade on the democratically elected government in Gaza. He's upped U.S. military aid to Israel to record lengths. He's supporting the Saudi dictatorship, which in turn is suppressing the democracy movement in Bahrain, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, it could go on at length. So if there's going to be democracy in the Middle East, it's going to come in spite of the United States instead of because of the United States, and at least until Obama has finished his term and somebody else new may change these policies.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, we have two questions. We'd like to attack them.
Do you want to take the Syrian?
The Syrian. I am personally not supportive of Bashar al-Assad government, and I don't think the question today is whether you're supportive of this regime or another. I mean, we can have a moral question, that we can always agree or disagree upon, but then there's also the political question. From a moral point of view, what Bashar al-Assad is doing is completely reprehensible, is immoral, and is unjustifiable. But on this argument also, we could also be very faulty on many dimensions, and we don't need to get into that. Now, the question is, will the regime survive? I don't think the regime will survive. I think the regime knows that its days are counted, but it's not going to go down without a fight of that. This is clear. They made it clear. They will not go down without a fight. The big problem is how far the opposition is capable to topple the Bashar regime. And what is clear is that the opposition is having great difficulty in being unified, have a clear military strategy, and not being prone to the priorities of regional powers and international powers. And here where comes the role of Russia, but also of Saudi Arabia, of Qatar. There are multiple agendas in the Middle East now playing in Syria. What does that mean? We have the Russians are supportive of Assad, not because he's like them, an authoritarian ruler, but rather because they want to have a foot in the Middle East, and it's perfect to be allied with Syria to do that. The Saudis are supporting the rebels, but they don't want the rebels to be too strong because they don't want an agenda which is not in conformity with Saudi Arabia. Hezbollah is going to defend the regime because they know if they don't defend the regime, they're going to be next in being attacked and repressed. So they have an interest in, are they right or wrong? It's not a question of right or wrong, it's a question of how can you convince them that actually joining the democratic process is good for them. In Lebanon, they definitely joined the democratic process and have proved to be a party that defended the nation of Lebanon, even if it was not to Israel's interest, but it was to Lebanon's interest. But they did prove, Hezbollah proved that it did play the democratic game in its own country. The problem is, with regards to Syria, you also have the Iranian intervention. Iran wants to have a voice, so it's easy to have the voice through Bashar al-Assad. At the same time, you have Turkey. Turkey tried to play the advisor to Bashar al-Assad and tried to pull Bashar al-Assad in his direction to show him that it's advantageous to the regime to modify and adapt, just like Saudi Arabia tried, or like how they influenced Yemen. But Bashar could not trust that he could trust the Turks. So in all this mess, you are going to continue in a very unstable situation. Now, the latest news of the Russian taking side and willing to intervene to stop the fighting is sign that everybody is saying Bashar al-Assad's regime cannot continue. The problem is for how long? And it is particularly problematic because the opposition, given that it's now a new opposition trying to group various different groups, it is going to take it much more time to be effective because it wants to be representative. It's much more, as we know in politics, you are much more assertive if you're dictatorial and authoritarian than when you are democratic. So how are you going to combine different interests is very difficult. Here, I think there is a role to play by the international community of taking guns away from everybody. In my view, that's what needs to happen. You need to have either a UN intervention and you take away the guns from everybody, but this is not what the Saudis, the Russians, or the Iranians, or the Turks see or the Syrians themselves see as interest of them.
Well, I think the worst case scenario will perhaps be the saving grace in a way of the situation, because we're heading toward a situation where all of those parties stand to lose if this conflict boils over. And right now there are like 1 million refugees in Lebanon, in Jordan. Certainly in Lebanon, it's destabilizing the situation. Lebanon, as you know, is a country that had a very long civil war that destabilized the region. So I think, unfortunately, it may be the conflagration and the spread of it that will finally get these interested parties to see an alternate route in the case of Syria. But that's a question of military strategy and diplomacy that maybe we're not able to predict. There's too much that we don't know going on behind there. It's certainly, insofar as there's a germ of a question from the other side of the room about, is there a role for the United States, despite the fact that it has played a role historically in supporting these very dictators? Yes and no. The continued support of dictatorship is, a decision that the United States can revisit. Insofar as the United States is not able, I don't think, to go in and teach democracy or install democratic government for anyone, it can pull out and remove some of the obstacles in more stable countries toward democratic transition. There is no doubt. Just a point on that, and further illustration, though, of that we're not dealing with some strange part of the world that has its own rule of politics. You mentioned the April 6th movement, which was a student intellectual movement that formed in Egypt in sympathy with the labor strikes, right? They were, interestingly, in touch with Serbs who had worked to overthrow their own dictator, right, much earlier, but also had read Gene Sharp's handbook written for the Burmese. And according to Gene Sharp, right, you can never fire a gun, and you never negotiate with the dictator until he is on the airplane leaving the country, right? And so when we look at the rebels and we see in Syria that they're not negotiating with Assad, it's a little too late to be following Gene Sharp, because once you've got bullets flying, you no longer have the political card. But you can also see why they're doing what they're doing, right? The Egyptians, according to him, made a fatal error because they only asked for Mubarak to step down, and they did not insist on the military stepping down immediately, so that the military led Egypt for a crucial year. And spoiled, I think, that transition. But anyway, let's go on to some new questions.
Okay, the second question was asked by a gentleman who was standing here.
Yeah, she answered it.
Where was that gentleman?
Over there, he's over there.
Back there.
Okay.
There he is.
Yeah.
Oh, do you want to repeat your question?
No, she answered
Oh,
well, it was about Americans' role.
She answered it.
Spoiler in not living up to its democratic. But we could go into, but let's not right now, the long effect of the Cold War on the Middle East. The Middle East was as much.
The last 2 decades have been worse as the United States throws its weight around it.
Yes. Absolutely. I mean, if you'll let me finish, right? The people in the Middle East, part of what we're seeing in the energy of the Arab Spring is the fact that the peoples of the Middle East had looked on after the wall fell in 1989 to see the United States, supposedly, we can debate, promote democracy and a democratic transition in Eastern Europe, but not in the Middle East, and apply a very different set of principles to their own dictators left over from the Cold War period, right? And so that it is that sort of frustration over a course of 20 years that also fed into, I think, the revolutionary moment.
Hi, I hate to mess up the format, but I have a mini question first. Would you agree in Egypt, much more than 51% of the people wanted to get rid of Mubarak?
Of Morsi?
Mubarak wanted 2 years ago?
No, Mubarak, before the revolution happened. More than 51%, definitely, right?
We don't
have a poll.
We don't have a poll, but I mean, the fact that, I mean,
things were bad.
Okay.
They wanted to change.
Conversely, in Libya, the life was so good, much more than 51% of the population loved and they were proud of their leader, Gaddafi. Isn't that correct?
Do not know. Do you know of a poll?
I don't know.
No.
No.
But we don't have to be. So.
Can't speculate.
Guess?
No, I can't answer that.
So if there's no poll, why in the world then Obama administration, after receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, why did we drop 20,000 bombs on top of Libya without a poll? Can you explain this?
Want to pick that up? You're the American. Jump into Obama's mind and.
Well, I mean, I think this is a simple answer. I think Obama does what every other president since World War II has done. He's not any different. We thought we were going to get change with Obama. We didn't get any change in terms of what's going on in other countries and U.S. policy. His policy on civil, well, all these issues that have just come up in the last few days, in the last week, seem to point the use of the drones. You can name it, and the American military. We live in a militaristic state, and we have to accept that. And the United States, I would argue, has come to a conclusion a long time ago that force of arms will settle issues first and foremost before we sit down and talk.
Why didn't they drop a single bomb on Egypt?
I'm sorry?
Why didn't they drop a single bomb on Egypt?
Oh, Egypt's too critical.
Yeah, but there's also the important notion. I mean, Egypt does not have the oil that Libya has. You know, we should not forget that we intervened when the oil started to burn, and we're scared it's going to fall under the arm of Gaddafi. But I also think there's a very important notion in international relation that was used in the war in Libya, the right to protect. Libya is this beautiful case example of how you use this new notion created by the UN in 2000, the right to protect. In other words, when do you intervene in a country and disrupt or in question the sovereignty of the state, and you violate basically the sovereignty of the state, which is the basis of our international system since Wilson. Since Westphalia, to be more precise. Since 1648, our international system has been based on the sovereignty of states. We cannot violate states. The right to protect, and Libya represented a case by which we said we should intervene because civilians are being attacked by their own government, and we cannot continue that. This notion has been used in other cases, but Libya represents the successful version. Now, why was it used? Because of oil. Was the U.S. only responsible? I'll have to correct you that the U.S. was not the only one in that war. There was a very important role to play by the European. The Italian played a very important role. The French played a very important role. And there was, for the first time ever in Arab history, an endorsement by the Arab League for such a war. And you had the war financed and participated by countries of Qatar and United Arab Emirates, which was never before. So actually Obama, from international relation, he did a very good coup, a very intelligent military act that did not cost the US too much. Was it in violation of the rights of the Libyan? Yes. Was it in violation of human rights? Probably. Are they the only one faulty? Should we not also faulty the rebels and the Gaddafi regime? I think the latter.
Or
not the former.
Alternatively, Gaddafi was on Tel Aviv's hit list.
Sorry?
Gaddafi was on Tel Aviv's hit list, enemy list.
Oh, okay. Well, that's very connection. Okay.
Sir, your turn.
It's very hard to follow that last comment, but I'd like to change the topic slightly. Your knowledge of history, all of you, is very impressive and informative. You use the terms constitutional government and democracy and saying the Islamists are in favor of it. But when I think of constitutional government and democracy, I think of rights of minorities, of women, of gays, of religions other than Islam, of all kinds, basically protection of minorities. And I'd like you to comment, please, on that. Where is that in all of these countries? How is that being addressed by the Islamists?
Very good question.
Great question. Yeah. I'll take two pieces of it.
Yeah, you go ahead.
One? Okay. What's that? Oh, in many definitions of constitutional government, there would be protections of the rights of minorities, right? And the question is that happening today in the countries that have experienced the Arab Spring revolutions? Is that correct? Is that
Sure.
a fair
Thank you.
paraphrase?
Yes.
Under the Islamists, right.
Right, okay. I'll take two pieces of that. One, historically, even in the United States, the Constitution did not at first protect the rights of minorities. That's a political process, so I question whether constitutional government necessarily protects minorities. Constitutional government is government that allows a political community to negotiate the relations amongst the citizens and their relative rights. But I don't know. That said, as we noted in 1876, the Ottoman Constitution explicitly was designed, and that parliament was elected with the effort to integrate minorities into government. So that has historically been the case in the Middle East. There have been cases of it. That said, what has happened
Christians
today, particularly we'll stick to Egypt, right? The Egyptian constitutional decree, we'll call it, rather suffered from, we'll say, a lack of due process last fall in many ways, but nonetheless does promise, if there's language about equality for all Egyptians and respect. That said, it is an Islamic party that was elected, right? And many Christians in Egypt are actively debating and wondering whether they have, what kind of place they have, and how to define citizenship in Egypt today. There are many Egyptian Christians engaged in that conversation and seeking that place. There are many others who are voting with their feet and leaving. And there have not been the guarantees and the assurances coming from the government that they would like to see, right? The violence that has occurred in and around Coptic churches in Egypt has been part of a larger pattern of violence, and many Copts resent discourses that project them as a sort of monolithic group that are all marching in lockstep behind their patriarch. So it's a very complex situation, but at the moment, these revolutions are not even dealing with the rights of their majorities, much less their minorities. So it's not, we are not there, and sorrowfully not. But I'm not sure that the lack of minority rights today presupposes a lack later, or calls into question the possibility of constitutional government right now.
Yeah, but here also I would like to point out something about the Muslim Brothers in Egypt, because they're today who are in power. The Muslim Brothers, especially in Egypt, as she rightly explained, was formed in 1928. So it's an old party. And particularly over the past 15 years, the young generation of people in the party and the party itself has had lots of very serious debates about citizenship, about the place of the Christian in any future Egyptian constitution, and they've made major headways in changing the language that the older guards of the party had in the 1970s. There's a beautiful article by Muna Gobashi who discusses how the parties in the 1990s, when they decided to take the bluff of the government, when there were elections under Mubarak, said, fine, we're going to enter the elections. We're going to participate, even if you're going to give us only 20%. And within that period, there was very serious discussions about when we talk, what do we mean when we talk about an Islamic constitution? They started talking about the fact that women's rights have to have full equal rights, and finding Islamic texts that prove that women can have full equal rights rather than half rights, as some Islamic scholar interpreted. They found another interpretation that shows that women can be treated fully equally politically. They started talking about the right of Christians, and Morsi came as far, I don't know if it's Morsi or somebody else, who came as far as saying that they are full equal citizens, they should have the full equal rights. The problem today, as she rightly pointed out, is that the problem is defining the constitutional right of any person in Egypt, not whether he's Muslim or Christian. But I wanted to point out that we should not forget, whether it is a Nahda in Tunisia or the Muslim Brothers in Egypt, they have reworked and rethought of the difficult role of minorities, something they did not do in the 1970s and 80s. But since the 1990s, 2000, they're grappling with it in a serious matter. And I think also the role of, and the sectarian or the religious attacks against the Copt in Egypt have less to do with religion than has to do with, I would say, sectarian violence, inequality, problem of protection of religious spaces. It's not so much framed that the Egyptians are not, the Christians, the Copts are not Christians because are not Egyptians, because the Copts are very much assertive of their Egyptian identity. But it also comes from the fact that there is not enough space to discuss together as a result of years of authoritarian rule.
Ma'am? Oh.
When you say the Turks and the Saudis and the Egyptians, you're talking about the governments, and I really appreciate that, but during the Arab Spring, I was actually living 5 minutes from the Egyptian border in a lot working for Hilton, and the people that were there did not reflect the government that was ruling. And I was wondering if you guys had any access to any kind of text or anywhere where I can find, I have anecdotal stories from people that I've met, but more of these stories of the actual people and what they're actually concerned about. Like, they don't want to go to Israel, they're like warmongers. No, they all have to go to the military. They don't want to see themselves and their children's brains blown out. Mm-hmm. You know, like, and the people, like, during a tenting, which was, the Arab Spring went into Israel, which no one around here even heard about. There were thousands and thousands of people in the street just freaking out because they couldn't afford to live in their own homes. Prices were raising so much. The same thing, they could have jobs, but the jobs can't pay for you to have a house. So, you know, how do you? You
want reading material about how people, how the average person in Egypt or in Tunisia or relate to that? There's some very, very accessible stuff that you can find on the web. Mm-hmm. And there's a very good publication lately that came up by the Middle East report, MEREP. Oh, yeah. Very beautiful one, MEREP. Yeah. It's very easy to find, where they give you very beautiful stories by various individuals who were in the revolution, the average person, how he felt, how he organized, as well as the activists, how they organized themselves. And they had also a very beautiful latest publication, I think, last year, on the revolution and the culture, how people, through arts, through calligraphy, through writings on the walls, were manifesting and expressing their feelings, their attitude, their concerns, their worries, on a very average level, because basically it was about, we want just a good, want a decent life. It's not even about a good life. I just want a job. I want a house. I just want to be free. We take our freedom for granted, but over there, freedom of the majority and the minority is oppressed, and you cannot solve the freedom of the minority before you give freedom to everybody.
Right.
Yeah, I think that was issue 265 that just came out recently. That had a good report on Egypt. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a website called Jadaliya.
Published a book, yeah.
Jadaliya. It has lots of information, both personal stories as well as political analysis of the various of all the Arab countries and the
There's several other blogs that also. There's something called Egypt Source, run by put out by the Atlantic Council, which will translate a lot of things, which is nice. I'll show you that. The Muslim Brothers are actually running into a little trouble in the countryside. They're acting like a corrupt party, much as the glamour and the shine of Ennahda in Tunisia has now been dimmed, and the Salafis are seen to be much more honest. And why do people like the Salafis? They're sort of seen as much more orthodox and fundamentalist, in their religion, but they seem to be more altruistic in providing social services, food, education, cooking gas to very poor people in the countryside without the political strings that the Muslim Brothers are demanding. But one of the more provocative, I think it was an opinion piece I read just yesterday, speculated that there would be a basis for the secular opposition to the Muslim Brothers to unite with the Salafis against the Muslim Brothers, right? Yeah. Which really tosses the whole, our preconceptions into the air to think that the secular liberals would unite with the, very religious Salafi Islamists against the Muslim Brothers, but around these bread and butter issues that the Muslim Brother government has not been able to address. So real politics is happening. And I think the tent that we call Islamic politics is huge. And that what I predict we'll see in the next 3 to 5 years is the mushrooming of many rival Islamic parties, so that to be Islamic would be it would become a generic term like being democratic. Yes, the Republicans and the Democrats in this country believe in democracy. So what? Which kind of democracy are we talking about? Which kind of Islamic justice do we talk about? The old Ottoman Islamic justice. Remember, the Ottoman Empire existed for 400 or 500 years, and for most of those years there was not sectarian violence. Right? The Christians of the Balkans in the early years of the Ottoman Empire appreciated the fact that the Ottomans had removed their feudal lords and restored property rights and so on to them. Right? There is a kind of Islam and a history that many Islamists can call upon that is based on a coexistence with the minorities in their midst. And some have already begun to do so against the much more, I would say, there's a faction that unfortunately right now is wielding the greater power in the Muslim Brothers in Egypt that carries much influence from the Gulf, from Saudi Arabia, an area that had never had a large minority population and draws on a very different historical experience of Islam. So I think we will see many contending, as you have pointed out so well, visions of what Islamic justice and what constitutional Islamism might look like in the coming years.
Sir?
There have been some recent newspaper stories on what appears to be interesting going on in Yemen. Mm-hmm. And it appears that they're having a large national discussion among highly diverse, large number of constituencies. What do you think is going to happen with that? Do you think there's a chance of a strong democracy coming out in Yemen?
I mean,
I'll leave that to the political scientists to make a prediction about the future.
Political scientists don't give prediction about the future, but they can analyze to you a little bit what are the possibilities. Yemen is a very fascinating country, because contrary to what people think, they have a tradition, they have a history of political parties, more in the south. They have a tradition of a very active women movement, which is very impressive. A women's movement, where movement by women defending the right of women without using a Western language. They can be all covered from up, from up here to down there, and they would be went out to the street against Ali Abdullah Saleh, accusing him how dare he use women as an excuse to not give people freedom. So that's very fascinating. But it's also a country which is very poor, in which the tribes are very diverse and have been empowered lately because they are a vehicle for political participation. We often hear in the West, when we say tribes, we think of them, they are retarded, they are really outdated. But tribes, because of the lack of alternative political parties or institutions, they have been beefed up and encouraged, but they form like political parties today. They have their issues, of course, but it just what this tells us that there are lots of various interests that are being mediated not through a constitutional government, because the president and Saudi Arabia did not want to encourage constitutional government. So what this tells us is that we have a country that has great potential. Basically, it's political parties, it's activists, it's youth, and it's women, but also which has serious problem, mainly it's poverty. It's the presence of Al-Qaeda in it, the lack of state power. The state is weak in Libya, in Yemen is not strong, and there is no serious attempt to make it stronger, because to make it stronger you have to have a stronger army and you have to have less intervention from Saudi Arabia. And I think Saudi Arabia is not interested in having its poor neighbor have a strong democratic state. So that's where. What can be the future for it? I think what saves Yemen is that Saudi Arabia is its neighbor, because Saudi Arabia does not want major problem in Yemen. And also we have an important American presence over there because we want to control Al-Qaeda and don't want it to blow out of proportion. But what if we are thinking in the long term, what needs to happen in Yemen is some serious investment in infrastructure, in poverty reduction, in state institution, in government, good governance. And this is possible by relying on new figures. Now, the latest, what happened in Yemen, we got rid of the ruler, Ali Abdullah Saleh. His vice president became the president, and he is somebody who's more into coalition building. But still, without solving the problem of massive poverty, massive illiteracy, lack of infrastructure, and lack of police which can control outside of just the major cities, you are going to have always a weak state, not a failed state, a weak state. And to strengthen a state, it means you need to strengthen the institution of the state, but also the accountability of the state. It is possible, but you need to have the will to invest in it. And the will to invest in it by the regional and international power is not there. And it's too important to be left on its own, because if you leave it on its own, maybe it will do something. But it's not being left on its own.
Yes, sir.
One thing I'm worried about is the elephant in the room is oil.
Mm-hmm.
1900, they were all on camels.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we have oil behind democracy. Before that time, there was virtually none. The British were the first in there with the oil and so forth. Tell me, if the oil is shut off, do they go back to tribal situations?
I mean, I assume you're talking about Saudi Arabia. You're not talking about Egypt. You're not talking about Syria. You're not talking about Iraq. You're not talking about Tunisia.
I remember H.L. Hunt had great amounts of money in there originally. They threw him out years from death. But go ahead.
No, I just want to clarify it that, you know, Egyptians are not tribal. The other question.
Do you want to repeat the question?
Yes. Okay.
What about the effect of oil?
If oil is cut off, all this democracy that you speak about, which was brought about by oil, where will it go?
I'm sorry, okay, I mean, you can talk more, but oil did not bring democracy in the Middle East. Oil brought authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. Oil is the cause for the perseverance and the strength and the durability of authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, despite the fact that the Berlin Wall fell and we had a big wave, the third wave of democratization. So oil never brought democracy. Oil is important in the story as how it prevented democracy and what could be done about it. How can we have oil and democracy? Because we tended to say, because we have oil in the Middle East, we don't want to rock the boat because it's easier to deal with one leader than to deal with Morsi or Nahda and X, Y, and Z. But I'll let you expand more on it because...
You took the words out of my mouth. So, you know, the oil has historically been the obstacle. There was a very nice article written, I think about 2005, 2006 by some political economists on Iraq. Reflecting that we had invaded Iraq and along the way decided maybe the point of the invasion should be to democratize Iraq after toppling Saddam Hussein. And the writers of the article noted that the way to bring about a democratic Iraq would be to prevent the oil revenues from flowing to the state. Yeah. Right? That as long as they're flowing into the hands of an oil minister and to a ruler of a state, a single force, you will not have democracy in that country. That is why, you know, for example, the Iranian Revolution did not, in '79, produce a true democracy in Iran because the mullahs just took over the revenues that the Shah had enjoyed, right? And if they had instead parceled out and privatized oil and parceled out all shares and revenues to the citizens of Iraq equally, perhaps we'd see democratic politics emerging there. So we'll leave it there. I think we have
yes, after World War II, in the post-colonial era, as these countries became free, they developed a strain of Ba'athist politics and employed mainly by these young colonels who
perform the same rule as they did in Turkey earlier. Is there any anything remaining from that strain of political thought and
Baathism?
Baathism? It sort of combined Arabist socialism.
Yeah, it was. And I think what you're talking about intellectually, the ideology and the political vision of Baathism of the 40s and 50s, is something very different from what guided the states of Iraq and Syria in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, okay, and to today in Syria. Although I wouldn't call it Baathist in Syria right now, but very interesting. It was called Arab socialism, right? It was started by two school teachers educated in France, one Muslim, one Christian, and it tried to solve the problem that the Ottomans could not solve. Right? The Ottomans had ruled in that area up until 1918 with a kind of patrimonial or paternalistic vision of how Muslims and Christians should get along. Muslims would be the rulers, but they would be bound to protect peoples of the book. That would include Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians over in Iran and under the Shahs there. But it would be a hierarchical relationship, right? In comes the idea and the ideal of equality by the mid-19th century, right? And the Ottomans could never figure out politically how to convince Muslims who had enjoyed the privilege of being superior, first-class citizens, convince them to give those privileges up and accept equality with Christians. So the Baathists come in and they come up with this idea that they think will solve the problem. Because remember, Baathism began in Syria, a place with a large minority population, right? Not only of Christians, but of minority sects related to Islam, right? And they said, we're all equal because we're all Arabs. And Arabs preceded Islam. Islam is the greatest flowering of our common Arab culture. But that therefore means that we are all really equal participants in this great culture, and we will revive Arab culture. It was an ingenious solution by two philosophy professors, right? And it drew many of the minorities to their ranks in Syria in the 1940s and into the 1950s, and particularly interestingly from rural areas, right? My book has a chapter on a guy named Akram Hourani, who organized peasants, the first peasant movement in the Middle East in the 1940s and 50s, and many of those peasants were non-Sunnis. They were Christians, they were Alawites, they were Druze, they were others. And through a vision, through a constitutional government of equality based on a common Arab culture and the revival of such, right? They cast all the inequality of the colonial era as a foreign implant and as not part of Arab culture, all right? That Arabs had had an egalitarian culture beforehand. It's an ideological move, but it solved an enduring political problem, right? But Syria in the 1950s, as today, became the scene of centrifugal political forces. The Saudis, the Iraqis, and the Egyptians, the Americans and the Russians all pulling different ways, and the political arena flew apart, right? In came a new Ba'ath Party out of the military, completely different from the old philosopher's vision, and they represented that, increasingly, that Alawite minority, all right? The same label, but a false label.
But they also always framed it, in an Arabness, which is, you know, the Alawites are concerned with, they still frame themselves in a very Arab way, but they're concerned with their power, because there's some notion we don't talk much about. There's also a notion of privilege, not as sect, but as a group of people. It's a class issue. These are, today, they are the rich people, and they want to keep themselves rich. You know, so we frame it always as Alawites or Shia against Sunni, but it's really a question about who controls resources today. And the problem with the states in the Middle East is it's the only way how many minorities or people who are excluded from power gained power was by getting into the state, capturing the state, and making money off the state. The only way to stop it was to have constitutions, which is what this revolution is about. And Arab uprising are still very proud Arab. If you look at them, most of them Christian or Muslim, Shia and Sunni, Islamists, non-Islamists, have still framed that we are proud Arabs and we want to reclaim it as Arabs, but not the Arabs of Ba'ath, not the Arabs of oppression, but a modern Arab where, above all, you protect your rights, irrespective of who you are. But the problem is how you're going to implement it, because the devil is in the details.
Just what does Ba'ath mean?
Ba'ath means revival.
Revival.
Or Renaissance.
Or Renaissance, yeah.
And one of the ways to do that was to gain the power was to get into the military.
Yes.
Hafez al-Assad and military, there were 3 military coups alone in 1949 and went back to some civilian rule, and then before you know it, the military's in for keeps by the late 50s, early 60s. And the same thing was going to happen in Iraq, and of course the United States helped the Ba'ath Party get into power in Iraq, and when they came into power in the 60s, the United States gave them a list of about 5,000 communists, and the Ba'ath were not communist, and the United States we were fighting a Cold War, and the Ba'ath Party took care of the communists for the U.S., literally. So that's big power politics, too. Nasty stuff.
On
Jennifer.
that pleasant note, how about a hand for our speakers and our moderator?